Welcome to the Wisdom of Bad Movies. I'm Tony Baugh. This is a podcast dedicated to the saying, things aren't as bad as they seem. I'm going to be talking about some films that no one really seems to care about in an attempt to show that even things that have been counted out, forgotten about, and just plain disregarded are useful and have something to teach us. Each episode, I'll talk about my favorite bad movies and try to reveal something about the movie that actually makes it worthwhile. What is a bad movie? Now, I know the definition of a bad movie is usually about how schlocky the film is or whatever, but that's not what I mean when I say a bad movie. For this podcast, a bad movie is either a film that has dramatically underperformed at the worldwide box office for whatever reason, or a film that has been panned by critics, or both. And that's it. I'm looking forward to discussing some crappy movies with y'all, and hopefully we'll see how some things shouldn't be thrown away so easily. This is the wisdom of bad movies. Episode 1. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is really a horror movie. Let's consider the movie Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles a goofy kids martial arts movie whose protagonists bound around a decaying pre-gentrification New York in secret, fighting crime and eating pizza with the same voracity. A bunch of grown men in rubber suits pretending to be teenage turtles who are ninjas, taught the art of ninjutsu by a mutated rodent, complete with a soundtrack that includes music by MC Hammer. Does not sound like the premise for a film to be taken seriously, but sounds rather like a campy, inconsequential, lighthearted, disposable action romp. However, it's actually one of the great horror pictures of the 1990s. At its core, it's a film about children who feel let down by those who are supposed to protect them, specifically their parents. Not about a multicolored amphibious cadre of Sai Nunchaku, bow staff, katana-wielding, hormonal youngsters deigning vigilante superheroics in the wee small hours of the morning. The horror in this film is not in the dark hues of cinematographer John Finner's slightly muted palette or in the subdued coloring of the spotted costumes, sinews of the reptilian foursome, but it is found in one scene of the movie in particular. The scene is well known by any casual aficionado who's viewed the film at any point. The Foot Clan is a burgeoning crime syndicate in New York City inspired by, quote, something that supposedly happened years ago in Japan, unquote. The Klan seems to be predominantly interested in recruiting disaffected youths to people their ranks. In the weeds of a moonlit night, after we have been introduced to the state of an unrecognizably crime-ridden New York through the montage of diurnal petty lawbreaking, after the Turtles rescue the mighty and loquacious April O'Neil from the clutches of gang violence in a subway after she is assaulted, after Raphael brings her back to their lair, who would later be the source of great conflict, Master Splinter being kidnapped, needing to be rescued, etc., we hap upon an abandoned warehouse repurposed as a hideout and video arcade game pool hall laden hangout spot for young new recruits into the Foot. There, a smooth-talking Sam Rockwell leads a couple of teens into the belly of the Leviathan of the Foot, where he assures them that all of their repressed desires can and shall be met. They can play games at the late hours of the school night, smoke cigarettes, play poker, and so on, thereby seeming to give to the uninitiated what they had been longing for in the first place: humanization and acceptance. And this is the first taste of the great horror of the film. The roving camera objectively displaying number upon number upon number of young people who have been pushed towards joining a shadowy crime syndicate for no other reasons than that they have been left behind. We see this reality played out in the life of the Danny character and the implacable dynamic he has with his careerist father, Charles Pennington. Ever the workman, reporter April's boss, Charles is not portrayed as a fatherly figure to Danny that we as the audience are to believe is instrumental in his life. Danny, like the new recruits, has been abandoned. In his book, Black Skin, White Masks, Martinician psychologist and phenomenologist Frantz Fanon limns a haunting portrait of the colonized mind of the black man living within a colonial regime of Western powers, particularly of France. He paints a bleak picture. For 1952 Fanon, because the fatalistic and cynical Fanon of 1952 is not the sanguine and prophetic Fanon of 1963 who wrote The Wretched of the Earth. The black man he writes about is insecure, longing dubiously for the day that he can not only be valued as his white colonial counterparts, but also to actually be white He discloses a black male's psyche riddled with insecurity and a lack of self-esteem, these men being repeatedly discriminated against, dehumanized in their social sphere, repressed systematically in their homelands, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Algeria, France, made to feel less than, constantly in a state of exclusion. On this wise, Fanon cites the great social psychologist Germaine Gex, putting her thoughts in conversation with the writings of another contemporaneous colonized black philosopher, Jean Venus. Through Gex, Fanon uncovers how Venus, though brilliant, suffers from abandonment syndrome, that he would like to fill the mantle of affection, but that in his writings, being black, he is alienated and alone, and how this lack of self-esteem as an object worthy of love has serious consequences. It keeps the individual in a state of profound inner insecurity, as a result of which it inhibits and distorts every relation with others. I'm quoting now. This lack of effective self-esteem always leads the abandonment neurotic to an extremely painful and obsessional feeling of exclusion, to never fitting in and to feeling out of place, effectively speaking. Being the other is a term I have encountered on several occasions in the language of the abandonment neurotic. To be the other is to always feel in an uncomfortable position, to be on one's guard, to be prepared to be rejected, and unconsciously do everything that is needed to bring about the anticipated catastrophe. End of quote. Therefore, when I am abandoned, I am otherized, I am blackened, I am, in actuality, become catastrophe itself, actualizing a devaluation of self that I perceive in my neurosis to be imminently awaiting me. I become the catastrophe that I dread and that I am more than sure will happen because I fear that I am not worthy of love to begin with. This is the genesis of the antisocial behavior that stems from abandonment syndrome. Danny and the other youths feel betrayed because they feel no love from their parents, energizing and exasperating their sense of abandonment, a point that the Shredder makes very clear in his rousing speech to them. Notice the insistence here upon the familial, even going so far as to establish himself as their new father. Take note of how skillfully he languages the idea of rejection versus acceptance.
You are here because the outside world rejects you. This is your family. I am your father.
As he begins his speechifying, he even wraps the dragon doji around the head of one of his initiates, saying to him, "You make us proud." This is not done on accident. This is intentionally done to tap into the sense of abandonment that these teenagers have experienced, to express to them affirmations of approval, thereby tapping into the catastrophe that their presence predicted and predicated, the catastrophe in the world that they must now become. And this catastrophe will invariably lead to petty crimes, as we see take place in the film, which may eventuate in morphing into more serious crimes. What could be more terrifying than that? Nothing readily comes to mind. A whole generation of young people animated by empty isolation towards violent and nefarious ends. The only difference is we will not have Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, and Raphael to save us when this social devolution happens. Listen to Master Shredder as he continues.
There is a new enemy, freaks of nature who interfere with our business. You are my eyes and ears. Find them. Together we will punish these creatures.
Shredder here responds to the certain ways in which these boys have been abandoned by those closest to them, abandoned in respect to how they feel betrayed by those who should have protected them, institutions such as the state, the church, schools, etc., with respect to how they expected reciprocity, emotional availability, or affection from loved ones, in respect to how they desired affirmation and understanding from their fathers. But we know he just wants to exploit their anxiety-ridden fervor, their swelling sense of abandonment, for his own avaricious means, a point that he makes conspicuous in his screed about the Ninja Turtles who, quote, interfere with our business. The use of the first person plural possessive pronoun our, a manipulative overture to their need to be included. Again, The greatest horror of this scene is found in the sheer number of young people who are at the warehouse that night. Every one of them represents a failure of the family unit, a systemic failure, particular between the generations, from father to son. When Shredder instigates the kidnapping of Splinter, the inevitable father figure for our heroic four, the Turtles are lost. Upon arriving at April's hideout, in a rural area outside the city, they train to be stronger for the approaching fight, but they are empty without their father and teacher. They yearn for what was taken from them. They pine for their only source of acceptance in the world. They cry out in the night for their father, petrified by the realism that they may never see him again. What is more, when Leonardo, the de facto leader of the group, has an encounter with Splinter on the astral plane through lone meditation, later cajoling the team to meditate around a fire that night, when Splinter appears in the azure flame out of his captivity, he repeats statements that are affirming to them, that bring them solace and clarity. He brings them words of affirmation. How do we save the lost, abandoned among us, this generation of youngsters who do not feel affirmed, understood, who do feel instead blackened, otherized, alienated, and marginalized for no other reason than that they are young? This question leads me to what is possibly the most horrifying element, even more than anything else, about this movie. That is that it doesn't offer any clear solutions. At the end, we're led to believe that Shredder is this irredeemable bad guy, even worthy of death. He falls off the building into a trash truck following his epic rooftop fight with the Turtles and Splinter, and is then immediately executed, at least to the audience's mind, by one of our good guys, Casey Jones. Master Splinter renders these words before Shredder falls to what would be his death. But how is it that he died without honor? His methods were questionable, yes, but the outcomes were not. He taught the young people how to fight and how to survive. The commission of evolving petty crimes and some felonies aside, could it not be argued that the Shredder at least provided some semblance of the family structure and stability that these children sorely needed? At the denouement of the plot, all we know is that Shredder is dead, and that Danny and his father's relationship is mended, at least ostensibly. But what of the other scores of young people who were members of the Foot? Surely they don't return home, as the conditions there are likely the same as when they left. Where do they go now? That the only reliable father figure they have has been likely murdered by a sociopathic, sports-addicted vigilante, and the most productive family unit they've ever had has been forcibly dissembled. The film tends to deal with that they're there, but it never deals with why they're there. Apropos of the Japanese motif that runs, at least superficially, through the film, perhaps the answer to this question can be found in an old Bushido text from Conversations with a Samurai from 1709 to 1716, one that contemplates the meaning of duty and service, of what we owe to one another. Hagakure, by Yamamoto Tsunetomo. It is said that the spirit of an age is something to which one cannot return. That this spirit gradually dissipates is due to the world's coming to an end. Therefore, though one would like to return to the spirit of 100 years or more ago, it could not be done. Thus, it is best to make the most out of each generation. Perhaps this is instructive for us today in our modern social context. Perhaps this is the pathway towards ending the abandonment syndrome that has invariably led to antisocial violence in our cities among our youth. Perhaps simple affirmation of sexual orientation, affirmation of silly sounding music, affirmation of the validity of a lost generation is the antidote to abandonment and alienation. In this way, perhaps the film's greatest example of a constructive rejoinder to abandonment syndrome is found in how April O'Neil's father, who has died, thereby abandoning her inadvertently, has left her a house that sits on a sizable parcel of land. It is to this house that she and her turtle companions is able to escape and recover when the Foot destroy her apartment. Thus, her father has left her something of value that is literally constructive, i.e. the house on acres of land, a physical construct. Therefore, the only constructive response to those who have been abandoned may be what provision we leave behind for them, for the next generation. The wisdom of bad movies.